Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the penultimate case in our long-running series, Politics on Trial. I'm talking about the O.J. Simpson murder trial. Murders, because there were two. The murder of his ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ron Goldman. On October the 3rd, 1995, Simpson was acquitted by a jury of both crimes. This case, which ran for 9 months, probably generated more TV coverage than any other court case in history before or since. It became, in the United States, a national obsession. It was, in all sorts of ways, a deeply political event, but it was also a harbinger of, a prophecy of, a window into our future. I was in America in early October 1995 at the time of the O.J. verdict. Because of the fallibility of human memory, it's 30 years ago plus, I can't actually remember where in America I was. I think it might have been in Georgia. But I do remember precisely where I was on the day, in that I saw the verdict announced on TV in a diner. I was sitting in a diner because I wanted to be with other people to see how they reacted. I was aware this was a huge event. The trial had lasted for 9 months. The jury had only started to consider its verdict the day before, and to everybody's astonishment, after a 9-month trial, the jury reached a verdict within 4 hours. Actually, it turned out it was only really 2 hours of discussion of 9 months' worth of evidence. Overnight, the speculation was beyond fevered about what the verdict might be. And at 10 a.m., the cameras in the courtroom, because the case was televised, were ready to record the verdict. There was real tension. I had sort of been following the case in the sense that I was aware of it, but I have to say I didn't know much about the details. It's really important to remember 1995, 94, 95. This was the pre-internet age. Effectively, this was the era of cable television. This was the definitive cable television event. And from Britain, where I was for almost all of the trial, I was only in the States for a couple of weeks, happening to coincide with the verdict. It was quite hard to follow it. You couldn't catch up online. You had to have cable TV, which I didn't. The American channels, which covered it 24 hours a day, wall to wall, didn't really translate. The time difference got in the way, so the live coverage in California was too late to watch in the UK. The BBC covered it a bit, radio covered it a bit, newspapers would have reports on it, but you had to be pretty devoted to follow the ins and outs. And frankly, I didn't know the ins and outs of the case. But I had a sense of just how it had convulsed America, and I was fascinated to see the outcome. I had an instinctive view, as many people did, that Simpson was guilty, but I had no view about what verdict the jury was going to reach. My memory of it, and a lot of people will have a similar memory, watching on television in a diner, big TV, and a few of us watching it, but actually in the diner, there wasn't much of an atmosphere, is that, and I'm not sure which channel it was, say CNN or one of the others, there was a split screen in that we were shown the courtroom and we were shown the verdict being delivered, but there were also cameras recording the responses of various audiences outside of the court. And in particular, I don't know where these cameras were, but there was footage of a group of white students, effectively. It was in a college somewhere, but the crucial thing is that this audience was all white. And we're probably talking about 100 plus people sitting on chairs. Again, it was a communal experience. I think following the trial for many people was not a communal experience. It was late night cable TV viewing from bed, but the verdict was a huge communal event. A white audience watching the verdict, and then somewhere else, a black audience of similar size, I think black Angelenos, watching in a hall somewhere, say another 100 people. And when the verdict was announced that Simpson was not guilty, the white audience let out a kind of collective groan of dismay, and some of them doubled up like they were in pain. They grimaced, and then there was silence. And the black audience burst into cheering and whooping and hollering. A lot of them got to their feet and punched the air. And I thought, oh my God, this isn't a legal case. This is a sports event. Not because O.J. Simpson was a famous sports star, though he was, but the way that people were responding to this case was much more like watching the coverage of a World Cup or something like that. Familiar coverage where you're shown split-screen footage of fan zones as the winning penalty is scored in the World Cup final, and one group of people double up and grimace and give out a cry of pain and then go silent and turn away and disperse into the night. And another group of people scream and holler and hug each other and punch the air and have an experience of communal ecstasy. That's what this was like. Or what it really reminded me of is those announcements of where the Olympics are going to be held, where you're shown the two groups of people who are hoping that it'll be their city. And then when the envelope is opened and the verdict is read, one group scream and holler and the other group look like they've been punched in the stomach after all the years of work that they put in. So first of all, I thought, this is a sports event. People are responding like they were supporting a sports team. And secondly, like everyone else, I thought, wow, everything about this event is framed through race, the politics of race, racial identity. And this is evidence of a deeply racially divided society. I wasn't alone in thinking that. Almost everybody came to the same conclusion, the pundits on TV, the commentators in the newspapers. But it was immediately visible. It was there within seconds, the evidence of that deep division. And that's what this seemed to be, a case decided by race. With hindsight, knowing more about it, I think, though that is clearly a large part of the explanation of what happened in the O.J. Simpson trial, it is not all of it. It's necessary, but it is not sufficient to see it through the prism of racial politics and racial division. Actually, to use terminology which is a bit more contemporary, the O.J. Simpson case took place at the intersection of a set of power dynamics in American society. It was an intersectional event, and it's only really possible to understand what happened through the interrelation between these power dynamics, of which I would say there were four at least. So clearly race was one. But this was also a case about sexual and gender politics, that is, the power dynamics between men and women and how men and women perceive those dynamics. It was a case in part about class. So a lot of time was spent analysing the makeup of the jury, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. The jury were predominantly non-white, the jury that ended up reaching a verdict, and 12 jurors were originally selected, 12 jurors and 12 alternates. And because the case lasted such a long time, 9 months, it was brutal and attritional. These people were sequestered. They had no access to TV or newspapers. Many of them were bored out of their minds, stuck in a hotel, sick of the hotel food. They had gone stir crazy long before the verdict had been reached. Many of them had dropped out for various reasons. Of the original 12, only 2 saw it out. 10 were drawn from the alternates. But that final 12 that passed judgment was made up of 8 African-American women, 2 white women, 1 African-American man, and 1 Hispanic man. But they were also, on the whole, drawn from a particular strata of Los Angeles society. They were, broadly speaking, a middle-class jury, and I'm going to come back to that. So we've got race, we've got sex and gender, we've got class, and then also, crucially, the power dynamics of celebrity. Celebrity is power, particularly in America, particularly in Los Angeles, in the age when TV dominated people's lives. 1995 was probably peak TV era in the history of America and in some ways the history of the world. Celebrity was power. And it was the interplay of those power dynamics that explains this case. Now, in the case of 2 of those power dynamics, the interplay between race and celebrity, one thing to say about the O.J. Simpson case is that it was the mirror of, an inversion of, in its trajectory, the story I talked about a couple of episodes ago, the Cassius Clay, as it became Muhammad Ali case, the one that reached the Supreme Court. In that instance, the trajectory, the story that I told, was of a legal contest that, to start with, and for most of its duration, was understood by everybody to be primarily about race, certainly by Ali, by his supporters, also by his opponents. This was about a black man, a famous black man, a black nationalist, a man who was making a stand on the basis, in large part, of his racial identity and its position in the hierarchy of American society. And people's views of the case were absolutely shaped from the beginning by race. The white men who ran boxing had a particular view. Ali and his supporters, crucially his supporters in the Nation of Islam, had a particular view. But by the end of the case and the result at the Supreme Court's decision to side with Ali changed the trajectory of his life and of his identity in America to the extent that he became a man who, not entirely, of course, but largely transcended race through his celebrity. He became in many ways the most famous human being on the planet, and he was someone whose fame was more than his identity as a black American. He was beloved around the world by people of all races. And in the United States, he became beloved of white as well as black Americans. He became Muhammad Ali. The name said something more than that identity that he'd forged in the early and mid and late 1960s. So he went, and his case went, from being about race to celebrity transcending race. With Simpson, it was exactly the other way around. So O.J. Simpson was the kind of celebrity at his peak, and by 1994, when the murders took place in June 94, 95 when the trial took place, he was past his peak celebrity fame, but he was still one of the most famous people in America. And if a British audience wants to try and understand what his level of fame was, the closest analogy, I think, is the fame of David Beckham today, which is global. It transcends national boundaries. It used to be said that if you were caught up in a dodgy situation in some part of the world and found yourself facing men with guns who were not the same colour as you and were threatening you because you were, say, in the middle of a civil war and you didn't speak the language, the best thing you could do was to utter the words David Beckham in the hope of finding some mutual point of reference. This would be like David Beckham now. He's not at the peak of his fame now, but he's still not far off it. One, and this is all very hypothetical, so don't call libel lawyers. One, being divorced from Victoria Beckham, Posh Spice, and two, having been accused of murdering her in a brutal way. Imagine how that would convulse everyone and everything. O.J. Simpson, before this case, was extremely famous. And it was the kind of fame that he himself, as well as other people, believed transcended race. So in an interview he gave in the 1970s to Playboy magazine, when he was asked about his relationship to black politics and to black racial identity, O.J. said to his interviewer, "I am not black, I am O.J." And that was how he lived his life. His fame was based on his fame as a football player, a college football player, and then in the NFL. But it went beyond sport too. He was perhaps best known for his Hertz rental car advertisements, for his cameo appearances in movies. He was a kind of cartoonish character, and he often appeared in cartoons as himself. He was thought to be unthreatening. That was part of his persona and part of his appeal. And also, weirdly, it transcended gender divisions. I first heard of O.J. Simpson as a schoolboy in Britain. I can remember this vividly. In 1977, Christmas 1977, I was given a book. I was aged 10, nearly 11 at the time, called The Book of Lists. People of my age might remember The Book of Lists. It was the beginning of the world that we're in now. We live in a world that has been listified. The beginning of the listification, everything being lists, because lists are fascinating, gripping. People love a list, was this book, which was a massive bestseller. Random lists of stuff, and I loved it. It was absolutely, if you'd asked me age 11, what's the greatest book ever written, I would have said it's The Book of Lists. And I loved it for two reasons. First, because I loved lists, still do, like everyone. maybe a bit more than everyone. And secondly, because it was American and it was really weird and exotic, and I had no idea what they were talking about half the time. It was a glimpse into a culture that I knew because I watched a lot of TV and most of it was American. Dallas and the $6 Million Man and Charlie's Angels. And it was part of that world, but I hadn't heard of a lot of the people and things they were talking about in these lists. And I can still remember two of the lists were just the results of a survey, I think of middle school kids in America, who were asked, who is the celebrity that you most admire? Boys and girls. And the boys list and the girls list were very different. So the boys admired Lee Majors, the $6 Million Man, and the girls admired Farrah Fawcett, came Farrah Fawcett Majors. A lot of celebrity intermarriage then as now from Charlie's Angels. But number one on both lists by a long distance, the majority of middle school kids, boys and girls, their most admired celebrity was someone I had never heard of called O.J. Simpson. And you can look him up on the internet. So I think I asked my dad or someone explained to me, oh, he's a football player. But I didn't understand why is this guy everybody's favorite person? But he was. And he knew it. That was his persona. I'm not black, I'm OJ. But in the trial, his defense was that he was being accused of these crimes, indeed was probably being framed for these crimes because he was black. He had to go from being a celebrity who transcended race to being someone whose racial identity was the key to his defense. So it was the reverse trajectory of the Ali case. By the time the trial was over, though O.J. Simpson remained an extremely famous man, but also really by this point infamous, there was no question that his celebrity transcended his race. Race was the prism through which everyone now thought about the new kind of celebrity that O.J. had, the fame, the infamy of a man who had been acquitted of crimes that many people were certain he had committed. However, for the prosecution, the case that they were going to build depended on a dynamic that was neither founded on celebrity nor race. At the heart of the prosecution case was an argument that explained the event through another fact about O.J. Simpson, one that was barely known at all, only known to a very small number of people, was completely at odds with his image as this cartoonish, smiley, non-threatening, transcendent celebrity. The fact that O.J. Simpson was, to use the old-fashioned terminology, a wife-beater. He was a man who had serially abused Nicole Brown Simpson, the woman to whom he was married, from whom at the time of the murders he was divorced, but not estranged in the sense they still had a relationship. But during his marriage to Nicole Brown Simpson, he had often found himself confronting the police who'd been called to his home because of reports of domestic violence. He was, on one occasion, charged and convicted of beating his wife, who had been found by police half naked and bruised, screaming in terror. But because of his celebrity, he'd been given a kid's glove treatment. After they were divorced, Simpson had stalked her. There was a lot of evidence, including in the form of audio recordings of Nicole Brown Simpson calling the emergency services for help, terrified, clearly terrified for her life. Just before her murder, she had contacted a women's refuge. There was a lot of evidence. The trajectory of Simpson's relationship with this woman was violence, stalking, coercive behavior, and all of the grounds for thinking he was capable of killing her. And that, for the prosecution, was at the heart of the case, coupled with the other central facts about this case, and the prosecution viewed this as a set of facts. There was overwhelming evidence that he did it. So the story of spousal abuse provided effectively a motive, an explanation. And then the circumstantial evidence was, it's hard to find the word for it, prolific. So I'm not going to say, did he do it or didn't he do it? What I'm simply going to say is the evidence was overwhelming. And what I'm about to say now is just a summary, a brief summary. There's more to it than this. But O.J. Simpson's blood was found at the scene of the crime. It was a bloodbath. Nicole's throat had been slit. Ron Goodman had been butchered. There was blood everywhere. But there was also a little trail of blood away from the crime scene that looked like, given there were also bloody footprints, dripped from the left hand of the assailant. And it turned out afterwards that O.J. Simpson had a cut left hand. The bloody footprints were size 12s and of a particular shoe. O.J. Simpson was a size 12 and he owned those shoes. The blood of the victims was found in O.J. Simpson's car, and there were traces of blood at his house, of theirs, his blood at the crime scene, their blood at his home. A glove, famously, notoriously, was found by the murder scene, and another glove, the other half seemingly of that pair, was found at the back of the guest house on O.J. Simpson's property. O.J. Simpson had no alibi for the time of the murder. The time was never exactly pinned down. It was sometime between 10 and 10:45, probably between 10:15 and 10:45. O.J. Simpson never got his story straight about where he was during those minutes. He could say where he was before 10. Afterwards, he was picked up by a driver and driven to the airport for a flight that had already been booked for a trip he was making, a golfing promotional trip in Chicago. The driver who came to pick him up testified in the trial that he arrived early and O.J.'s notorious white Bronco was not parked outside his house. It was only there later. In that car was blood from the crime scene. He never could say where he was, and there were no witnesses who could attest to where he was during the hour in which the murder took place. As I've said, there was motive, there was an explanation. And then finally, there was his behaviour after the event, when it was clear he was going to be arrested and charged, and he fled. Most notoriously, perhaps the televisual event of 1994 was the chase of his white Bronco, in which he was being driven by a friend. No one knew where. Some people thought he was trying to get to Mexico. He claimed he was just visiting Nicole's grave. But he had written a note which was read out by his friend, Robert Kardashian. Yes, that Kardashian, father of Kim and all the others. Celebrity mutates into hyper-celebrity. And in the suicide note, he seemed not to confess to the crimes, but to be saying he couldn't bear to live with what was to come. And if he hadn't done it, why did he seem to be contemplating suicide? In the end, the prosecution did not make anything of his behaviour after the event. The Bronco chase was not part of their case. The prosecution didn't make much of the absence of an alibi. It did try to pin down his movements at the crucial time that this happened, but particularly the incredibly sketchy and vague first interview he gave to the police, in which he couldn't really say where he was or what he was doing, was not made much use of, partly because the interview of him by the LAPD, the Los Angeles Police Department, was so damn incompetent. And one of the problems for the prosecution was to know how to finesse the incompetence of the LAPD. So the case was built on a combination of the circumstantial evidence and the history of Simpson's appalling treatment of his wife and then his ex-wife. And that turned out to be a terrible mistake. That calculation was wrong. The assumption of the prosecution was the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming, and then the story that we can tell of who Simpson really was, a wife beater, would feed into that, and the two would reinforce each other to secure a certain guilty verdict. Everyone would be able to see you couldn't tear those two things apart. Well, the defense did tear them apart. And in the end, Simpson's history of his treatment of Nicole seems to have been discounted by the jury. It didn't really factor in to their calculations. From what we know, the brief time they discussed the case, they didn't talk about it at all. Instead, for them, the question was about the relationship between the evidence and Simpson's race. And the question that the defense was able to plant in the jury's mind as to whether the evidence was reliable, to be trusted, given, above all, the Los Angeles Police Department's long history of racial brutality. This was just a few years after the Rodney King riots. But the long history, going back decades, of a police department that was known across America to be one of the most racist in the country. Its brutality, its corruption, and the defense wanted to claim the possibility that it would have rushed to judgment, identified a black man as the likely suspect and then framed him. In that sense, the key evidence in this case was not anything that was presented in court. It happened before the case came to trial. Two kinds of evidence. One, the evidence that was discovered in focus groups that were held actually for the prosecution by, and at this point, helping lawyers on both sides select juries, because lawyers have quite a lot of discretion in rejecting jurors they think will be unhelpful to their case. It had become not a science, but certainly an art for which experts were highly paid for their advice. And one of those expert firms that offered advice in jury selection conducted focus groups for the prosecution, getting a selection of Los Angeles citizens together and asking them their views about this case. It had been covered widely enough early on by this point that lots of people had views. There was almost no one who didn't have a view of the case. And the results were startling. So before anything had happened in a courtroom, simply on the basis of what they had heard, and quite a lot of the evidence had already been reported in the newspapers, it was clear from these focus groups that there was a stark racial divide. White Angelenos were likely to think that Simpson was guilty, and the black members of these focus groups were likely to think that he was not. But more important than that, the group that was most likely to believe that Simpson was not guilty were black women. And at one point in one of these focus groups, a group of black women who said that they didn't think that OJ did it, they thought this might be some kind of stitch-up or he was a victim in some way, were asked what they would believe if it could be shown with 100% certainty that the blood at the scene was OJ's, so that he had been present at the scene and had been bleeding at the scene of the crime. Not that his blood had been found at the crime scene, but 100% that it was his blood and that therefore it tied him to the crime scene. And in that group, it didn't make any difference. They said they still would be inclined to think that he was not guilty. As it happens, the lead prosecutor, Marsha Clark, rejected this evidence from the focus group. She decided to discount it. It was too absurd to be true. And she believed that she had an ability to communicate, particularly with female jurors, particularly with black female jurors. She was herself white, but she'd had success with black juries made up predominantly of women in cases where a man had been accused of killing a woman and that there was a history of spousal abuse. But crucially, those cases were ones that didn't cut across racial lines. She could get a jury of black women to convict a white man of killing a white woman. This case was different. But there also seemed to be evidence, astonishingly to Clark, that's why she discounted it, in these focus groups, that the black women thought of O.J. Simpson as a victim, not just a victim of the LAPD, but a victim of Nicole, in that they understood the power dynamic in that relationship to be that he was a successful black man who had made an amazing name for himself, and clearly he attracted all sorts of people who wanted a piece of his fame, a piece of his money, a piece of him. And here was a white, blonde woman who had got her claws into him, and he had been trying to get free of her. That was how it was framed. In these focus groups, that's how people talked about the relationship. And they couched it in euphemisms like, there's always give and take in a marriage. There's probably fault on both sides, which was exactly how OJ himself, before the case, defended himself against the charge that he had abused Nicole. He always said, she abused me, man. You know, in these fights, she gave as good as she got. I was often the one with bruises. I was frightened of her. Every marriage has its ups and downs. Ours was tempestuous. We're tempestuous people. Come on. Nothing to see here. This was a domestic. All of the trite garbage that men who abuse women trot out all the time. She hit me. The jury was inclined to think, broadly speaking, in those terms. So one of the other questions the focus group was asked is, how do you rate the accused and the victims? But the focus was on Nicole Brown Simpson, one of the tragedies of this case, Ron Goldman, who was probably murdered simply because he was at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was bringing back some glasses that had been left at a restaurant to Nicole's house. just was a bystander. He was a victim, but no one was that interested. And in these focus groups, no one was that interested in him. When they were asked, how much do you sympathize with OJ? They tended to score it 8, 9 on a scale where 10 is a lot of sympathy. How much do you sympathize with this woman whose throat was cut? 3, 4, 5 out of 10. The other evidence that this case was not going to play out the way that the prosecution had hoped came very, very early on, just after the murders, in the way that 2 stories in particular were covered, one of which was going to be used by the defense for its theory of conspiracy, and the other of which created a photograph which was going to be used by the defense to show that this is a case all about race. But actually, both of these events can only really be explained not by the power dynamics of race, a white police force persecuting a black man in Los Angeles, but the power dynamics of celebrity. The LAPD went out of its way to treat really famous people, like OJ, with kid gloves at all times, and they did it in the immediate aftermath of the killings. So one of the things that created the whole dynamic of the case was that when it was clear at the murder scene who the victims were, that one of them was the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, a decision had to be taken about when and how to notify Simpson of this fact. And it was decided that, according to informal LAPD policy, when a really famous person is involved in a case, it is crucial to tell them as quickly as possible about the facts, because otherwise they will hear it on TV, on the news. A reporter will call them up and break the news. And that always looks bad for the police. It looks bad for the police if a famous person hears the news from a reporter. So the priority was to make sure that OJ heard it first from the police. As a result of which, not that many hours after the crime was discovered, police officers were dispatched to his house to tell him the news that his ex-wife had been murdered. Not because they thought he had done it, although, of course, the first person you would look at in this case is the ex-husband, but because he was so famous they were terrified he would hear the news another way. They arrived at his house and found he wasn't there, he was in Chicago. But they also found all sorts of incriminating evidence. Now, normally, in order to search his house, they would need a warrant. They'd shown up at his house, the motive was to help him, but they stumbled across all sorts of things, including a bloody glove, the notorious bloody glove, and it was very much bad luck on the part of the prosecution that the man who found the glove, a police officer called Mark Furman, emerged over the course of the trial to be the most appalling racist. And Furman's racism, the fact that a man who was caught on tape repeatedly using the N-word, having denied under oath that he used the N-word, the fact that that was the man who found the glove was in many ways all the defense needed to show that this could at least potentially have been a racist conspiracy. But that's not why Furman was there. He was not there to plant the glove. He was there because, like all of his fellow officers, he didn't want to get on the wrong side of O.J. Simpson because they did not think of Simpson as a black man. They thought of him as one of the most famous residents of Los Angeles. And then the second thing that happened is when he came back from Chicago and it was clear, because they had stumbled across all this evidence, the Bronco was parked at a weird angle outside the house and it had little smears of red on it. It really looked bad for Simpson. They came back to arrest him and to take him in for questioning. By this point, the news media was all over it. There were cameras everywhere, helicopters flying overhead. One of the questions was, should he be handcuffed before he was taken in? And the decision was they should cuff him. But because he was so famous, they didn't want to give the press a shot of him in cuffs. They wanted to cover up the fact that his hands were cuffed. They wanted to help O.J. Simpson. Because of his fame, they were still nervous of how everything looked. They didn't want to be seen to be cuffing not the black O.J. Simpson, but the super famous O.J. Simpson. So they took him round the back into a shaded area of the house away from the prying cameras so nobody could see them putting the cuffs on him. But one intrepid photographer, guessing that they might do this, snuck round the back, stuck his camera up on a pole and snapped a shot of Simpson being cuffed in what looked like a shady area. It looked worse. And when this photograph was widely circulated, it looked racist, like they'd taken this black man off and they were cuffing him in a dark place in a shameful way. Within days of the crimes, the whole case was being framed not through the LAPD's craven treatment of Simpson because he was famous, but through images and through a narrative that could be used to describe a classic pattern of abusive behavior, not on the part of Simpson towards his wife, ex-wife, but on the part of the Los Angeles Police Department towards black men. So for these reasons, well before the court case started, it looked already set how it was going to play out, depending on the composition of the jury. And the composition of the jury was, by the end of the trial, given the evidence of the focus group, almost set up to favour the defence. One of the questions is, why did the prosecution allow a jury, the 24, so they were unlucky in a way about the people who dropped out, but why did the prosecution allow a jury that was so likely to be predisposed to see the evidence not through the prism of domestic abuse, not through the prism of celebrity in the sense that the police had actually favoured Simpson in the way that they treated him before he was brought in and charged, but through the prism of the way the police were likely to view a black man accused of a violent crime. So part of it is just the problem that Marcia Clark, the lead prosecutor, shouldn't have been prosecuting this case. The fact she shouldn't have been prosecuting this case was clear right from the off, because when she first got a phone call notifying her that O.J. Simpson was a suspect in a murder case, so she needed to start thinking about that as a lead LA prosecutor, she said, "Who's O.J.? Who is O.J. Simpson?" She'd never heard of him, which is pretty unusual. It more or less put her on a par with an 11-year-old boy in England, and an 11-year-old boy in England should not have been trying that case. Her ignorance of his celebrity, which actually wasn't just unlikely, it was pretty damn eccentric, meant she wasn't well equipped to judge this case, but also because of her history of successful prosecution in cases which included domestic violence, she didn't fully understand. She allowed her priors to sway her. She believed she knew how this worked, how it would play out. Like everybody else in this case, she was swayed by her prior beliefs. It's also the fact that the jury was not simply shaped by race. It was also shaped in some ways by the other dynamics at work in this case. A long trial, as everyone knew it would be, though no one knew how long it would be. The judge, Judge Ito, promised the jurors it would be over by February, which was like telling people the First World War would be over by Christmas. He was out by 8 months. It was only over in October. A long trial of that kind meant only certain kind of people could be jurors, and jurors were allowed, when they were selected in the pool, to give reasons why they couldn't. Their job wouldn't let them. You had to be able to take 9 months off work. You had to do the kind of work where your employers were likely to cover you for jury service of this kind, which meant you probably needed to be not someone who ran their own business, not someone who was self-employed, but someone who worked for a big corporation, but not the kind of person that the big corporation couldn't afford to lose for 9 months. So you'd be someone at a sort of low to middle level, not someone at the bottom of the heap who wouldn't be covered. The jury was made up of people who predominantly worked for big organizations, but not in managerial roles. People who, the majority of them, hadn't been to college, but they were people who were, broadly speaking, middle class, not mainly homeowners, renters, not homeowners, but people who were comfortably off. Only 2 of them were white. 10 of them weren't white in the final accounting of this. They were people who didn't read newspapers, who got their news from TV. Many of them were people who had an interest in celebrity, and they watched a lot of the celebrity TV shows, the cable TV shows that focused on celebrity. They turned out to be exactly the kind of people that the focus group had identified, particularly in the case of 8 of them, 8 African-American women who were predisposed through their priors to think that O.J. Simpson was likely in this case on a couple of dynamics, gender, sexual politics, as well as race, but the interplay between the two, a black man ensnared by a blonde woman, and the jury were told a lot of evidence from the defense in the trial that Nicole Brown Simpson was promiscuous, that her friend, Faye Renswick, was a drug taker. They tried to suggest maybe this was a drug hit because she hung out with druggies. They trashed her character, as the defense often does in such cases, but the priors of the jury were disposed to hear this, and the evidence dissolved in the face of it. The kind of people who were up for a long trial tended to be people who already had strong views. If you didn't have strong views about this case, you were likely not to want to be on the jury. So actually, the jury, almost by definition, were predisposed to take a view. And perhaps the most extraordinary moment in the whole trial came 4 months or so in, when one of the jurors, it emerged, had lied on her questionnaire statement about her past history in order to get on the jury. She wanted to be on the jury, so she hadn't revealed a crucial fact about herself, one of the questions they were all asked, which was, do you have any personal history of domestic violence? And she lied about the fact by saying no, that in fact she did. Earlier in her life, she had tried to issue a restraining order against a man who was threatening her. So she absolutely did have history of being on the receiving end of the kind of behavior that the prosecution were going to show that O.J. Simpson had displayed towards Nicole. So for that reason, you would think the prosecution, when this emerged, would want to keep her on the jury. Here was someone whose priors seemed to predispose her to be prejudiced against a man who was an abuser. That's why the question was there. We do not want people on this jury who will just hear the words domestic abuse, think of their own experience, and condemn. Actually, the prosecution wanted her off because by that point, the prosecution had realized its terrible mistake, which is that it had placed its bet on the wrong side of the board. This was not a case about domestic abuse. It was a case about race. The fact that this was a black woman was much more important than the fact that this was a woman who had concealed a history of being a victim of domestic abuse. It was the prosecution who wanted her off. It was the defense who were desperate to keep her on the jury, even though she had lied about the thing that ought to have predisposed her to the prosecution side. And Judge Ito, in one of the many moments where he expressed bafflement as to what was going on in his courtroom, said to the lawyers, wow, this is weird. I would have thought you lot would have wanted her off and you lot would have wanted her on. This case is like a mirror image, an inversion of what I understood to be the dynamics of this case, because by that point it was. There was also the fact that the case happened downtown in LA. This was a thing that was made much of at the time. It could have been tried closer to the scenes of the crime in Santa Monica, where the jury would be much more likely to be overwhelmingly white. There were lots of reasons why it didn't happen there, mainly practical reasons. The court downtown was equipped for the kind of media attention that would descend on the case. But also there were political reasons. Gil Garcetti, the DA, a Democrat, his base was downtown, and downtown in this case was used by all sides as a euphemism for race. Downtown attitudes, downtown lawyers, people who could speak downtown to downtown. That meant black. Garcetti couldn't be seen to move the case to a white district because it would suggest that he didn't trust black jurors to reach a fair verdict. So it would have been politically toxic for him. It had to happen where it happened. But it didn't have to be the jury so overwhelmingly skewed in its final makeup. The demographics of downtown were very mixed. Maybe a third of the inhabitants were black, a third white, a third other in all sorts of different ways. But the jury was overwhelmingly African American and overwhelmingly female. And the prosecution had let this happen because the prosecution did not use all of its challenges. It could have got some of those jurors off. It didn't because it was so confident that the combination of the domestic abuse and the circumstantial evidence was simply unbreakable. It was ungainsayable. My God, they were wrong. And so it's tempting to think that the case was foreordained by the jury selection, and in many ways it was. And yet it lasted for 9 months, and people's fascination with it is all the things that happen in the courtroom, the twists, the turns, all of these strange people who became global celebrities, Kato Kalin, the lawyers in the case, Marsha Clark, Chris Darden, Robert Shapiro, Johnny Cochran, who became the lead lawyer, Barry Scheck, Judge Ito, who became world famous, the Dancing Itos on the Jay Leno show. I mean, it just was a farce by the end. It felt farcical. It was beyond a show trial. It was like a pantomime trial. It's also true the prosecution had other disadvantages. So the celebrity element of the case, which turned everybody involved, the most minor people, minor witnesses, became celebrities. That disadvantaged the prosecution because almost everybody involved in the case found that they were offered large sums of money before, during, and after to tell their story, to sell it to the National Enquirer, to go on one of the many, many, many talk shows that covered the case night after night after night. Larry King up and down and sideways. And the trouble is, as soon as people had taken money for their story, particularly if they had taken money before, but also if they'd taken money afterwards, but lawyers could point it out while the trial was going on, it tainted them as witnesses. It particularly tainted one or two witnesses who lied under oath about having sold their stories, so the prosecution felt they couldn't use them, including one eyewitness who'd seen Simpson driving in his car looking pretty shaken up not long after when the murders might have happened, couldn't appear in the court. But it also added to the element of farce. It really was farcical, again, from the beginning. The chase of the Bronco a few days after the murders, an event which more Americans watched than watched the Super Bowl, and everyone was rushing to commentate on live in real time as it was happening. One of those people who commentated on it as it was happening was Gil Garcetti, the DA, was commentating on the fleeing of his chief suspect, like he was not the DA, but just another celebrity gossip. Many of the lawyers called in at various points to these talk shows to try and get them to take a particular angle, and some of them found themselves on air. Chris Darden, at one point, he said, unbeknownst to himself during the trial, found himself talking to Geraldo about one of the witnesses, a police witness, and he was saying he wished the witnesses would behave differently. He thought that they could toughen up. He was disappointed in his witnesses. Prosecution lawyer talking on TV during the trial about his disappointment in witnesses, some of whom still had to testify. It was lunacy. Some of the witnesses who didn't testify then did appear on chat shows, and the next day, lawyers would bring in videotapes of the chat shows to play in court, as though the real trial was taking place on sofas in TV studios. It was lunacy, and it was a kind of lunacy that Ito lost control over. By the end of it, no one knew up from down, in from out. And then the other disadvantage that the prosecution had is that the evidence was too overwhelming. There was too much of it. They had to make it all piece together. All of that DNA evidence, blood evidence, fibre evidence, the circumstantial evidence, the story of the car, the different witnesses, the time frame. Over and over again, the defence would pick apart little bits of the story, not always particularly convincingly, but just try and throw a web of confusion over something that required the prosecution to hold the jury's attention and get them to see how it all connected up. One side had to join the dots. The other side had two tasks, one of which was simply to confuse the jury, and the other was to say there's an easier way to join the dots, there's a simpler way. So the complicated way was to follow the evidence. The simpler way was to think there might be a conspiracy at work here, including the classic conspiracy theory argument. The evidence is too good. The blood samples too definitive. There's got to be something more to this than meets the eye. Why is it so overwhelmingly the case of the prosecution that everything points to OJ? Wow, that looks a lot like a conspiracy. In fact, in the end, neither the prosecution nor the defense had a coherent argument in this case because both of them had to argue two ways, in the sense that the most effective part of the defense case was to undo the DNA testimony because there was a lot of evidence that the LAPD processes, the labs, a man called Dennis Fung in charge of one of the labs had basically been incompetent. Fung was a disastrous witness. Barry Scheck was a brilliant lawyer who picked apart the DNA case just by showing that procedures hadn't been followed, blood samples had been left out too long, various blood samples had been missed. The crucial blood on the gate, which was OJ's blood, hadn't been spotted at the time, was only seen weeks later. So had it been planted there? Why was it so fresh weeks later? Just picking it apart on the basis of incompetence. The LAPD are incompetent. Oh, and by the way, also, they are capable of organising an incredibly complicated and sophisticated conspiracy to frame this black man, notwithstanding the fact that their history of their treatment of this man so far from being a conspiracy against him, was a conspiracy with him against his wife, his ex-wife. Leaving all that aside, these incompetent buffoons also happen to be people capable of successfully putting together a conspiracy which involves DNA evidence. Can't be both. Problem with all conspiracy theories, if they're incompetent, they almost certainly couldn't pull off the conspiracy. The problem for the prosecution was they had to admit the incompetence to push back against the conspiracy. So they had to say, yes, this hadn't quite gone by the book, that hadn't quite gone by the book, but look, the LAPD are under-resourced, these people are under enormous pressure, they were all doing their best, these people aren't racist. Oh, sorry, Furman is one of the worst racists anyone has ever seen or heard of, but he's a bad apple. Well, yeah, there are a lot of bad apples. Nonetheless, what we're looking at here is actually a litany of people doing their best under difficult circumstances. And even if you accept this doesn't look great, unfortunate that the guy who found the glove is a racist. Nonetheless, there's enough here. There's more than enough here. Yeah, they're incompetent, but come on. But at the same time, you've got to believe them, because a lot of the key witnesses were LAPD officers, including, fatally, Furman himself, who the prosecution put on the stand. Disaster, because then he turned out to have lied under oath about his use of racist terms. So the defense had to say these people are incompetent and conspirators, and the prosecution had to say these people are incompetent and trustworthy. No one's story added up. But in that kind of contest, where one side has to hold it all together and all the other side has to do is watch it fall apart, the defense had everything in its favor. If their job was to persuade the jury that confusion reigned over the course of 9 months, that's what they succeeded in doing. They also had help that the prosecution at various points was fatally incompetent, most notoriously Darden's impulsive decision, Chris Darden, to allow O.J. Simpson to try on one of the gloves, which by that point had shrunk, and he was wearing a latex underglove so as not to contaminate it. And it was a very tight-fitting glove, and there was a good chance it wouldn't fit. It didn't fit. It partly didn't fit because O.J. was a good showman. And in trying on the glove, he grimaced and he gurned and he stuck his thumb out so it wouldn't get on anyway. So that O.J.'s lead defense lawyer, Johnny Cochran, at the end of the trial, could mutter the immortal words, "If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit." All Johnny Cochran needed to do was throw confusion over the case and then tell an underlying story, which is a story of racist conspiracy. In his final statement to the jury, Johnny Cochran focused on the jury's obligations to their community to stand up to what Cochran said was the key fact that had been revealed in the trial, which is that Mark Furman was the worst kind of racist. And that sort of racism had to be stopped. And the only people in this case able to send a message that it was unacceptable were the jury. And Cochran said, in his, it has to be said, brilliant, summing up, a great criminal trial speech, beautifully constructed, expertly delivered, and also monstrous. Cochran said to the jury, "We know what happens when you don't stop the worst kind of racist. Who is the worst racist in history? A man called Adolf Hitler. What happened when he wasn't stopped? You all know what happened. You are the only people in this case who can put a stop to the real crime here, which is the crime of police racism in Los Angeles." When the jury retired, they had a lot to talk about, but they didn't talk about any of it. It is still astonishing that after all that time, they reached a verdict in 4 hours, of which about an hour was a readback of some piece of evidence. Weirdly, a piece of evidence that a lot of people at the time thought meant they were going to convict, because it was one of the most compelling pieces of evidence against Simpson. The testimony of the man who had come to pick him up to take him to the airport, which included this man's recollection that his car was not there, Simpson's car was not there because he arrived early, at the time when the murders were being committed. But he was confused on one or two other questions, including the question of how many cars were parked in the drive, and one or two jurors wanted to remind themselves whether this guy was a reliable witness or not, and they concluded, as they concluded about almost every witness, that they were not reliable. But what happened in the jury room, and we know this because jurors sold their stories afterwards, vignette about this trial, the TV coverage was such that ABC Just One Network assigned 4 people on the day of the verdict for each juror. Each juror would have 4 ABC people ready and waiting to film an interview with them if they were willing to tell their story. The jurors in various ways did tell their story. What happened in the jury room was that even though you're not meant to, at the start of a case like this, begin with a vote among all the jurors, ask people, do you think guilty or innocent? And the 4-person of this jury knew not to do that. But they didn't know how to proceed, so they thought they would have a straw poll. So they wouldn't say individually what they thought, but they would each write a verdict down, put it in a hat, and then they could tot it up. So the first thing that happened was it turned out, without anyone knowing how anyone had voted, that they were 10-2 in favour of acquitting. They then spent a couple of hours talking about not even the evidence, but just their feelings about the case. It was a kind of vibey conversation, and they all had random thoughts about the case. Different people were bugged by different things. One of them was really preoccupied with the glove, but others weren't interested in the glove. No discussion of Simpson's history with Nicole Brown Simpson. No discussion about that at all. Very little discussion of the DNA evidence, though some people had views about the LAPD for sure, but different kinds of views based on different bits of evidence. They had views about the crime scene. They had views about the implausibility of this and the weirdness of that. There was a sort of vibey feeling in the room that none of it really added up. There wasn't a massive conspiratorial dynamic in their discussions. They didn't set out to prove that he had been framed. There was no real discussion of alternative explanations. No one has ever come up with a plausible account of who did it. If Simpson didn't do it, they weren't interested in that. They were astonishingly not interested in almost anything. And then they had another go round after a bit of this, and it turned out that the two, and we know that one of them was one of the white women, who had at the beginning thought that she would try and do a 12 Angry Men and turn them around, but quickly gave up, first because she could see these people weren't interested. They weren't interested enough in the evidence, and she wasn't sure how to make the case, and secondly, because she had her own doubts. For her, surprisingly, much more than for many of the other jurors, the real problem was Furman. She had been really horrified by the tapes of Furman mouthing racist abuse that had been uncovered late on in the trial. An interview he'd given years earlier to a filmmaker wanted to talk about racism in the LAPD. And this juror and then the other juror who clearly thought it wasn't worth dragging this out given the results seemed to be a foregone conclusion, changed their mind. They did another straw poll. It was 12-0, and the jury was in. The result was in. That was it. One of the really interesting things, and I've long been obsessed with this, about the O.J. Simpson case is it's a perfect illustration of something in political theory that's called the discursive dilemma, which is that if you canvass a group of people on their individual views as individuals, you can get a result which is not the same as the view of the group. This is why juries should consider the evidence before they take a poll on what the individual members think. So the individual members each had their different reasons for reasonable doubt. How reasonable it was, I don't know, but vibey doubt anyway. They just didn't buy it, but for completely different random reasons. One of them bothered by the glove, but the others didn't seem to be that bothered by the glove. And if they'd talked through the glove evidence, surely one of them could have made the persuasive case that it wasn't conclusive at all, because there were lots of reasons to think that Simpson trying on the glove in the court didn't prove anything. And there was other evidence, including, crucially, the evidence that Nicole Brown Simpson had given her husband a pair of gloves exactly matching those found, one at the crime scene, one at Simpson's house, caked in blood. So you've got to push back against that evidence. Could you get a majority of the jurors, if they'd discussed it, to agree that? Possibly not. It might be that one individual was convinced, but the jury itself did not consider that grounds for reasonable doubt. And on, it seems like a lot of them were not that fussed by the DNA evidence, including the defence's case trying to show the DNA evidence was not reliable. They could have talked it through. They could have talked through the different police witnesses, the eyewitnesses. They could have talked through the evidence of the driver who saw that Simpson's car was not there, but they didn't. All they wanted was to hear, yeah, even he sounds like he didn't actually know completely what he was talking about. This is a really confusing case. We can't convict on this basis. But each of them as individuals had a different reason. So think of another way that they could have done it, which is let's have a vote on each of the possible grounds of doubt. Say, let's vote on the glove, and it might have been, 8-4, it's grounds for acquittal. But 4 grounds, 8 not grounds. The different bits of evidence, the DNA evidence, the other bits of circumstantial evidence, the eyewitness statements, even Furman himself. So some of them were clearly really agitated by Furman. All of them were distressed by what they heard. The jury, their faces showed what they thought. They were horrified by him. But was the fact that this man was a proven racist enough to acquit Simpson? You then have to believe that he was capable of planting the glove and on and on and on. And there was very little evidence of that. So it might be that, again, the jury might have thought, well, maybe a couple of them still thought Furman was grounds to acquit, but maybe the 10 others didn't. They could have found that if they'd done it evidence by evidence, even though each of them had a reason to think that Simpson should be acquitted, on the evidence, the group as a whole did not buy any of it. That is called the discursive dilemma. Group think, group rationality, when it's rational, is really hard. Groups can devolve into the prejudices, the prior beliefs of their individual members. And then what you get is essentially prejudgment, which is the same as prejudice. This jury was prejudiced. It was prejudging the case. A lot of those in the court testified to the fact that the jury seemed to have zoned out about 5 months before the verdict and stopped listening, stopped taking notes, glazed over, completely out of it. They'd gone mad in their sequestration. They'd lost the will to go on. They weren't willing to listen to the evidence. When it came to giving a verdict, they were just going to go with their gut. If you allow people to go with their gut, you get one outcome of group deliberation, which is non-deliberation. To do actual deliberation is hard work. Juries are hard work. Citizens' juries are hard work. Deliberative assemblies are hard work. Political theorists know this. But you get a different outcome if you do the hard work. But these people, for understandable reasons, they wanted to go home, didn't do the hard work, and so they produced that verdict. One of the lessons of the O.J. Simpson trial is that decisions made by groups of people across divides, so this jury was still divided. It was divided across racial lines. It was still 10-2 at the start. It was divided across gender lines. There were 2 men, 10 women. It was skewed one way in both cases, but not universally one way, but it produced a unanimous verdict because in the end, individual views were allowed to coerce the group into an outcome. If you want a different kind of group reasoning, my God, it requires an awful lot of work. It is not the default. The default is what happened in the OJ case. The verdict of the jury was not, of course, the end of this matter, not at all. 18 months later, there was a civil trial, a wrongful death civil trial, brought by the families of the victims. It took place in Santa Monica, so white jury. The lawyers were better. That is, the lawyers representing the 2 families were just better lawyers, but also they'd learnt the lessons of the disastrous criminal trial, and the burden of proof in a civil case was lower than in a criminal case. All of those things together combined to mean that Simpson was found liable for these deaths. He was ordered to pay more than $33 million in damages. He never came close to doing that. 10 years after the civil case, a bizarre case in Nevada took place. Simpson was accused of being part of a botched conspiracy to kidnap and rob that took place in a Las Vegas hotel room. It was a confused and chaotic case. He appeared before an all-white jury who convicted him on all charges. They presumably also had long memories. And he was sentenced to 33 years in jail. In the end, he served 9 before he was released on probation. By the time he died in 2024, he wasn't a forgotten figure. He was still extremely well known. But I think it's fair to say by the time he died, he was the notorious O.J. Simpson. He never got close to coming back to being O.J., the man who wasn't black. He was just O.J. He was always, from the point that he was acquitted in the criminal trial, always going to be known for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. But that's not the main story that comes out of the criminal trial. That is the trajectory of a different narrative arc. There are other lessons to be learned from what happened in 1995. One of them is that if you interpose evidence into a situation in which people have strong prior beliefs, in the hope that the evidence will lead them to re-examine their beliefs, it doesn't happen. And there is lots of evidence in all sorts of social science experiments to confirm this. In all sorts of divisive questions, immigration, climate change, the things where people are really convinced one way or the other, it's a hoax, it's the greatest threat to humanity. These people are necessary for a functioning economy. These people are sponges who've come here to kill us. People have strong prior beliefs. If you then introduce evidence, this is what the science says, this is what the experts think. Look at this chart, this data set, this graph. It doesn't bring people together. It drives them further apart. People will see the evidence through their priors. They won't re-examine their priors on the basis of the evidence. The O.J. Simpson case was a definitive example of that. There was no assessment of the evidence by the jury, in the sense that the evidence was treated as something to either confirm or be rejected by prior beliefs. Second lesson of the O.J. trial is that at that intersection of the power dynamics, at least of American society, and I suspect of many other places, the thing that loses out when there is a contest is gender and sexual political power dynamics, including with women. If something else is there to get in the way, if there isn't anything else there to get in the way, then women will side with women, women will side with abused women. But if there is something else to get in the way, above all if that thing is race, but not just race, because it also includes celebrity, the view of the jury of O.J. Simpson was shaped not just by his race, but by his celebrity. The idea, for want of a better phrase, that Nicole Brown Simpson was a gold digger, drawn to his glow, money, fame, power, all of it. That was strongly held among this group of people. When at the intersection these things collide, the thing that drops out is gender politics. And then finally, celebrity itself is just a massive but fatal distraction when trying to evaluate evidence, when trying to think through arguments, when trying to decide what you think about a particular case. There is a level of celebrity that just blinds and dazzles and confuses and allows people who want to say, look, this is all a shit show, right? It's all confusing. Celebrity really helps with that because celebrity warps everything, this level of fame. I mean, my God, the O.J. Simpson trial was a madhouse. And it was a madhouse driven by Simpson's fame. Think of what the murder trial of David Beckham, again, I am simply using this as an illustration, the murder trial of David Beckham would be like. Think of what a madhouse that would be. Think of how hard it would be for anyone to think or talk sense under those conditions. And from those three lessons, you get, I would say, a sufficient explanation of the election in 2016 of Donald Trump as President of the United States. The O.J. Simpson trial provides the template for understanding that event. First of all, because in that event, any evidence that was presented by anyone did not change people's prior beliefs. It tended to reinforce their prior beliefs, regardless of the evidence. I remember this vividly because I remember watching the first debate between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton live. By that point, it was possible. I stayed up late, unlike in the O.J. trial, and I watched it live. And at the end of it, I remember thinking, oh my God, that was scary and weird and horrible, but at least Donald Trump won't be president because it's simply impossible, my priors told me, on the basis of that performance, because some of the things he said were mad. They weren't just wrong, they were fantastically wrong. They were stupid. They treated people as idiots. And I thought, with all of my prejudices, my intellectual snobberies, my stupidity, I thought, well, something has been demonstrably proven here by this piece of evidence, this debate, which is that Donald Trump cannot be president of the United States. My God, what a fool I was. I've tried never to forget that lesson. My God, how stupid I was in my own reading of the evidence. It was not evidence in that sense. Nothing in the campaign presented in the way that people like me would think, well, at least that's proven something. Proved anything to anyone except our prejudices, our priors trump what we see. Second, when it came to the intersection of the various dynamics, race and class and celebrity and the politics of the relationship between men and women, the power of men, over women. It is that last that drops out. Again, vividly remember when the grab 'em by the pussy tape came out, many people saying, and I thought, sounds like they know what they're talking about, Trump is done. Because women won't vote for him now. Turned out women did vote for him. That is, white women voted for him. White women voted for him because they discounted that piece of evidence. And there were always explanations. It was conspiratorial, it was fixed, it was this, it was that. And Trump never apologized and never explained. Discounted that piece of evidence in favor of other prior beliefs. And it turned out that race trumped sex and gender in the power dynamics of that campaign. White women did not vote for a white woman, Hillary Clinton. Of course, many did. I'm generalizing here, but enough white women voted for a white man who abused women, Donald Trump, for him to win. And third, the power of celebrity just makes a mockery of everything when it reaches a certain pitch. Donald Trump's celebrity, pretty comparable to O.J. Simpson's celebrity in 94, 95. Donald Trump, one of the most famous men in America, TV star, The Apprentice, all that, runs for president. It just messes with people's heads. No one knows how to treat him, how to judge him. What is he? What kind of candidate is he? What is the basis of his pitch? And the result was people just covered everything he did endlessly to the point where it was impossible to think straight because there was too much information, too much volume, too much noise. It was a madhouse. That campaign was a madhouse. Respectable TV channels would cut away from a Hillary Clinton speech to show the empty podium at which Trump might speak, but at which he hadn't arrived yet, because he was just so goddamn famous. The O.J. Simpson trial, it seems to me, viewed with hindsight, was a harbinger of a world in which Donald Trump was going to be elected president of the United States. And frankly, if you'd said in 1995 that Donald Trump would one day be president of the United States, I would have told you, from what little I knew of America and politics and democracy, that you had lost your mind. But I know nothing because of my prior prejudices and intellectually snobbish beliefs. And I have to try and remind myself of that every single day. But I think there's one other thing to say about the O.J. Simpson trial, which is this all happened in 1995. These things that were revealed about how human beings evaluate evidence, about the different ways in which a skillful and well-rewarded defense team can exploit human beings' cognitive biases and their prior beliefs and their unwillingness to follow complicated arguments in the face of simpler explanations, not because they themselves are simple, they're not. Not because they're stupid, they're not, because they're human. We're all human. We all do it all the time. Here in 1995 was evidence of some of the features of how human beings deal with the intersection between class and sex and celebrity and race. But this was before the age of the internet. This was the days for which one can easily be nostalgic, when it was just cable TV. My God, the Larry King Show seems like Plato's Symposium compared to the cesspit of Elon Musk's X. Larry King himself, pretty sketchy character in various ways, is more like Walter Cronkite than he is like some of the people who now have the biggest audiences. This was the long-lost golden age of cable television. This was the TV world. This was still the world of the Book of Lists. These things were true. They were true then, they were true before then, they were true since then. But this was pre the age of the internet. What happens if you take those things that came out of the O.J. Simpson trial, things that could be learnt from that trial, about how human beings think and behave, about how they can be made to think, how their thinking patterns can be exploited by people who are skilled practitioners of the art of exploiting how people think. Another word for those people is lawyers. What happens when you add on to that, you put into that the internet, social media, Facebook, TikTok, Snapchat, the cesspit that is X? What happens to the thing that happened before the age of the internet when you add to all of that, those things that came out of that trial, the internet? What happens is the world blows up. Next time, it's the final trial in Politics on Trial, though, as I will explain next time, we haven't quite finished with this. There are still some trials to come I want to talk about, Maduro being one. But next time, I'm talking to the political scientist and historian specialist in the politics of the Middle East, Glenn Rangwala, about the trial of Saddam Hussein. And then coming soon, I'm going to be talking geopolitics with Helen Thompson. I'm going to be talking about what's gone wrong with political philosophy with Paul Sagar. And we've got a big new series coming up that we're calling Where Are We Going?, which is, I don't want to sound too pretentious here, about different ways of understanding the fate of humanity. Do join us for all of that. This has been Past, Present, Future.